4:03 a.m. The door camera blinked awake and the image was small and unforgiving. A woman in a navy dress, a pale pink vest over her shoulders, hair pulled into something that had once been tidy and no longer was. Her face was worse than the dress, pale under the porch light, a smear of dried tear on her cheek like a stain that wouldn't scrub out. She leaned against the metal frame as if the door itself were a support beam, as if any motion might make her dissolve. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply held up a business card between two trembling fingers and waited until I unlocked the deadbolt. There are two kinds of doors in my life: the ones I choose to bolt and the ones I watch for. For years, the watching was the work. My apartment had lines, cameras in corners like invisible eyes, a wall of feeds that scrolled in muted thumbnails, a neat column of labeled external drives, an old router I kept in a Faraday bag more out of habit than necessity. It felt like order. It felt like safety. It felt eventually like a profession of being needed. Her name was Elena Reyes. The card had 3 words on the back in a handwriting that was not ashamed. 48 hours. No explanation. No plea. A single number that meant either a deadline or a threat. She stepped across the threshold into the warm sigh of my hallway and looked at me as if she were measuring how much I cost. How much protection could be bought by deciding to let someone in. I let her in because she asked to be seen. She told me, between breaths that trembled and steadied, that Julian Vance was not a man who heard no. She said it like ledger entries, like facts. Lawyers, donations, contracts, reputations built into scaffolding that could crush a single career under an editorialized headline. But she didn't come to hide. She'd come with a small, sharp refusal in her voice. She wanted evidence to be made public. She wanted her name back. She wanted her life to be a life again, and not a file on an adversary's desk. She had the sort of competence that shows in small practical things. How she folded a jacket without creasing the shoulders. How she checked the door after we heard a sedan idling across the street. She had a map with markers, not because she needed me to tell her where to go, but because she understood that people like Julian preferred to move through rooms that were dimmed and quiet. She marked exits like scars she wanted to inspect. "You have 48 hours, she said finally, tapping the card. "That's a window. After that, he moves whatever we need into a place no one will ask about." I should have said no. The answer was simple enough in theory. Stay out of other people's fights, maintain distance, keep the system sterile and unentangled. But my life wasn't sterile. It was wound with favors and contacts and the patient muscle of watchfulness. I had learned to turn fear into systems. I had built a small, private command center that answered to nothing but a checklist. It felt noble. Until it didn't. Stay with me. This is where it starts. We converted the apartment into what I told myself was a temporary hub. A Faraday bag sat on the kitchen counter like a rotten fruit we could not compost quickly enough. Burners were passed around like props in an old play. The monitors filled with anonymous thumbnails that hummed like a ceiling full of quiet moths. My movement through that space had a practiced economy. Elena's did not. She moved like someone reacquainting herself with bones. We were careful in the way people are when they have something to lose. Not the tense, cinematic caution you see in films. Ours was quieter. Duplicate keys, names blacked out on doorbells, labeled cables that ran like neat veins behind the living room furniture. She scoffed at my labeled power strips at first. Then she added an extra note in my notebook. Trust. She wasn't a patient rescued into safety. She was a partner in an ugly logistics dance. She knew which facts mattered. Payment ledgers that didn't add up. Audit trails that had been sanitized with corporate patience. A stack of emails that formed a clean rope when laid end to end. Sarah, her assistant, became the inside hand, reluctant at first, then resolute. She brought printed logs that smelled faintly of old coffee, a memory of her office's bad kitchen. She slid them across the table like reluctant confessions. Marcus showed up when the world got noisy. He arrived with a hard case and a blunt face, a field operative who preferred actions cut in spare, functional lines. He did not talk about heroics. He talked about options, about containment, about the way a public reveal had to be constructed so that there was nowhere to hide. His voice in the apartment added a different temperature to the air. Urgent, practical, a kind of blunt arbiter of consequence. We debated exposure versus caution, like lawyers arguing the obvious. Elena wanted public accountability. She wanted her name spoken in rooms that had been used to hush other names. She didn't want Julian to be crushed in a dark alley. She wanted the room lit and the cameras on, because the thing he feared more than anything was the scraping of a reputation. I found myself hedging, measuring the balance between the ethical and the expedient. I had made a bargain with the world. I would watch so others wouldn't have to. That bargain had steady benefits, less drama, fewer entanglements, and stealthy costs. Staying felt responsible. Staying felt like duty. Staying also began to look like avoidance. You can learn a lot about what you lose by counting the small things. I started to catalog mine in a private column. Dinners canceled because a feed needed recalibrating. A birthday coffee skipped so I could watch a thumbnail replay of a sedan 3 blocks away. Relationships that frayed because I was never fully at home even when physically present. My emotional life had been hollowed out into a series of checklists. I slept on one side of the couch because the other felt vulnerable. I made oatmeal for one and called it an even evening. I named cabinets, labeled drives, and in the fine print of those labels I had erased spontaneity. Elena watched me assembling these habits, not with pity, but with a sort of quiet reading that made me uncomfortable. She didn't ask me to be braver or softer. She asked for honesty. "You stayed," she said once while we sat with a dim kettle between us. "And what you stayed for started taking everything that came after." It landed like a stone. I couldn't speak at first because the stone was lodged somewhere I couldn't reach with words. I had been living the paradox of protectors. The longer you watch for danger, the more you practice avoidance as a life strategy, until avoidance becomes the only language you speak. We had pieces, enough to begin building a public architecture of truth. Sarah's printed logs showed an unusual string of transfers. The ledger entries matched a discrete set of shell entities that did not map cleanly to Julian's known ventures. They smelled of deliberate smoothing, accounting choices made to present cleanliness. I won't pretend we hadn't expected this. What surprised us was how ordinary the mechanism felt. Contracts signed with polite language, favor exchanged for favor, reputations called in like IOUs. There was a coffee shop dead drop where Sarah passed us a memory stick in a sleeve of paper. It was anonymous in the way such things must be, but it was a weight in my pocket that felt, at once, both dangerous and precious. We didn't rip it open like a movie. We set it on the table between us and let it cool until we could look at it without wanting to flinch. We planned for the gala because Julian loved being seen. He loved the 400 pairs of shoes moving like a private tide beneath crystal chandeliers. He loved his name on placards and the way people toasted his generosity, while ignoring the strings attached to every donation. Elena insisted that confronting him there would deprive him of the one thing he used like armor: privacy of influence. Marcus argued the mechanics without thrill: crowd movement, exits, lines of sight. But it was Elena who chose to go on record. She would stand, speak, and make sure cameras recorded her words. I wanted to protect her, because that was my muscle memory. I wanted to manage the risk, to plan for contingencies. I wanted to create a safe bubble that would keep all danger outside. She refused to be bubble-wrapped. She refused the passive safety of being hidden away. She told me, in a voice that shook only once, that she wanted to take back the narrative. The night before the gala, she sat on my couch, the city humming beyond the blinds like a distant tide. She made no speech. She crossed a thin line on the checklist in my notebook and added a new item, written in her tight, certain script. Tell the truth. Own the room. That was the difference. She asked the world to hold her truth. I had spent years keeping things out of the world. I had stayed, and, in staying, had taught myself to expect danger. I had turned awareness into armor. But armor is blunt and isolating. It keeps out hands that might hold you as well as those that might harm you. The gala was all glass and soft light and the smell of polished wooded rooms. My monitors echoed those chandeliers in small, cold rectangles. We slipped in like people trained to look like they belonged. Elena in an understated dark gown, a single pin of pearl at her throat, a stake driven into the center of an arena that would not grant mercy. Marcus had a look that suggested the capacity for blunt movement. He kept to the margins the way someone does when they refuse to be seen, but are there if needed. Sarah, who had spent weeks trembling with the knowledge she had to give, walked with a quiet steel that surprised us all. Halfway through the evening, a man came close, closer than we anticipated. Julian moved through his room like a king moving toward an altar. He had a way of flattening people with a smile. You could almost see the room recalibrate itself to accommodate his walk. I felt the old reflex, the calculations that come before any response. I wanted to pull Elena back into an already constructed safety. I wanted to keep her life away from the things she feared. She stepped forward instead. There is a photograph I keep in my head from that moment. Elena illuminated by a chandelier above her, the circle of people refracting in the glass of my laptop screen decades away in my bag. She spoke with her voice steady and raw, with the kind of clarity that had nothing to prove to the room and everything to reclaim from it. Cameras panned. People leaned in like a chorus reacting to a note struck off key. Julian's expression was the first thing that betrayed him, his professional calm cracking at the edges. The shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A single noise, the immediate and brutal punctuation that rewrites the shape of a room. Someone pushed, someone screamed. I moved because my body still remembered the old equations of protection. The gun's report, the metallic taste of it in my mouth, was not the cinematic volley of movies, but a raw, intimate reality that hit delicate things and disordered the choreography of the evening. Elena moved not away from the sound but into it. She moved to the center of the choice. Her hand went to her phone not out of performance, but because she wanted the record to exist with her signature on it. She turned the camera toward Julian the way you turn a light on a thing you intend to see clearly. It was not bravado. It was a refusal to let the story be taken from her. I reached for Julian before the moment could become more than a bruise of time. I did not reenact any heroics. I knocked a wrist. I closed the distance. To say I disarmed him is both too little and more than the truth. The weapon left his hand as something suddenly small and ineffectual. The room became a knot of people and blood and the hiss of someone trying to find breath. Marcus moved the way Marcus moves, economical, immediate. He got hands on the man, secured limbs without flourish. Federal agents arrived as if the room had unspooled into consequence. They took control the way institutions do, with forms and voices measured and clipped, and the authority that carries weight. The arrest was not spectacle so much as procedure finally catching up. Julian did not break down in a neat cinematic collapse. He sat with a face like limestone, a man who had become used to transactions and was now judged by an accumulation of evidence that made his choices visible. He was led away in cuffs. There were no grand confessions. There was the quiet string of formalities that made truth a thing you could point to and read out. Elena's name was spoken aloud in a voice that did not come from him. It came from a public record. It came from documents that could not be edited away in a morning email. We did not celebrate like we'd won a prize. We sat in a small room with fluorescent light and the echo of the night's noise seeping out the windows. A federal agent read us the procedural language. What would happen next? The interviews that would need to occur. The subpoenas. The audits reopened and inspected. The system can be cumbersome and slow. It is also the thing that, in the end, moves with a steady surety the way machinery does. Justice, where it arrives, often arrives as paperwork. Elena's license was restored through that process. It did not feel like a trophy. It felt like recompense for a life interrupted, The reinstatement showed in an email. There were forms to sign, offices to visit. It was mundane and life-affirming in the most boring way possible. The far more meaningful repairs were not legal. They were domestic. They were the small reconstructions of life that happened behind the curtains. We reconstructed a kitchen that smelled like oatmeal and risk-averse mornings. I learned how to make something imperfect and call it dinner. Elena taught me that sharing a couch did not mean giving up all boundaries. We put labels back on things, the way people do after a move to remind themselves they've arrived. I labeled a power strip, living room, day, and wrote an addendum beneath it. Trust. It felt absurd to reduce the weight of relationship to a sticky note and a word, and yet the act had power. The word trust belonged on a checklist, in the same way that reminders of safety belong on a door. It was not a neat resolution. It was a symbol we both agreed to. There were other things I had to acknowledge. I had to say aloud the cost of staying. I had to name what my protective posture took from me. Spontaneity, warmth, the habit of sleeping with the other half of the bed empty, because it felt safer. I had been dressing my life in armor and mistaking the protection for virtue. Staying had allowed danger to be kept at bay, yes, but it also allowed me to lose small parts of myself that mattered just as much as servers and firewalls did. I had lost the ability to be surprised without calculating angles. I had lost the habit of making mistakes in public. I had lost invitations I never refused, because I was always half a step away, watching for the next thing that might need handling. Elena never called me a martyr. She called me honest once, in a way that felt harder to receive than praise. "You stayed," she said softly during one of our slow mornings, the city waking beyond the blinds. "And that cost you." She was not condemning. She was pointing, like a friend indicating a bruise you might not have noticed. I had to sit with it. I had to admit that the thing I'd meant as fidelity had hardened into a fortress isolating the very things I wanted to protect. The legal process rolled on without cinematic flourish. Depositions, audits, a small army of lawyers parsing the seams of Julian's empire until they found the threads that unraveled. Evidence was admitted. Tests and cross-examinations happened with the procedural boredom of institutions that move by precedent. Julian did not receive a tidy moral collapse in a courtroom. The consequences were structural: indictments, financial restraints, reputational damage that could not be bought back with pleasantries and late-night donations. That was what we wanted, not ruin, but accountability. It mattered, too, that Elena had insisted on being present for that process. She attended hearings. She sat in rooms where people in suits reordered reality in legal language. She watched the unspooling and did not look away. That was how she reclaimed a life that had been made into an argument against her. She did not seek revenge. She asked for visibility and for institutional mechanisms to do their slow work. She asked for name restoration, for a chance to practice living without an invisible hand rearranging her fate. Home after that felt odd. Old routines creaked into place like a chair returning to a favorite corner. We added small things to our days that felt like acts of courageous softness. I learned again the shape of a morning where the door did not have to be checked 3 times. Elena learned how to fold her hands at breakfast without scanning for exits. We put a small sticky note by the thermostat that said, "Trust." It was a gesture at once ridiculous and profound. It reminded me to let warmth in, and it reminded her that someone would not control the perimeter of her life for her. I slept on the couch less and on a shared bed more. It was a compromise that took months to saturate with comfort. Rituals replaced checklists in subtle ways. A real Sunday with 2 mugs of coffee, a walk without a purpose that ended at a bench because the bench was there. I began to hear my own voice unpracticed in conversation. The vigilance that had been a professional asset had become an emotional default. Unlearning it felt like therapy, and like the manual labor that follows a long illness. Small things mattered. A laugh that wasn't half-guarded, a day without a labeled cable sleeve, a phone call answered without calculating who might be listening. I confessed something that had been hard to admit, Even as the legal paper moved and the headlines cooled, staying had felt noble. It had felt like a vocation. But it was not only that. Staying had also been a way of living around risk without learning how to live in spite of it. There was a difference I needed to accept. Protecting someone is not the same as sheltering them from agency. If protection becomes a prison, it stops looking like virtue and starts looking like control. When the torrent of procedure settled into something like steady water, I began to inventory the things I'd lost. Friends I hadn't called back because I assumed they wouldn't understand. A brother's wedding I had missed because the timing didn't match an unreadable threat in a thumbnail. Meals eaten alone. Years I had accounted for in terms of preparedness rather than presence. They were not spectacular losses, no movie montage, no cataclysmic regret. But the accumulation of small absences created a scarcity of self. Elena never asked me to apologize for staying. She knew the shape of my choices. She asked me instead to choose differently now that choosing was possible. She reminded me that protecting people wasn't a zero-sum game where one must give up living in order to keep others safe. She wanted me to reclaim the capacity to be surprised, to open a door without calculating the consequences, to answer a call because it was from a friend, and not because the line had been scanned for threats. There were nights when I woke with the image of the door camera replaying, tiny pixels of a woman leaning on a doorframe, and felt grief like a physical weight. I had learned to confuse constancy with virtue. To the extent I mourned, it was for the parts of myself that had been excused away in the name of responsibility. Which is to say, I stayed too long, and in the staying I lost pieces that mattered not because they were frivolous, but because they were human. Recovery is not a single narrative beat. There is no perfect montage that reknits the frayed places. Instead, there are appointments and small, stubborn acts. I started saying yes to things again because someone had asked me to a movie, to dinner, to a park with no agenda. I let small failures happen. I burned the pasta twice in a week. I left a power strip unplugged. I forgot a minor camera firmware update for one whole month and lived through it. Elena laughed at those little failures the way you laugh when something human reasserts itself. Trust required active maintenance. We added trust to another list, because ritual can anchor habit. A simple line in the morning routine that said, ask for help, sit with others, share a meal. It was not dramatic, but the small rituals hardened into a different muscle memory. I began to close doors because I wanted to and not because I feared what lay beyond them. I began to invite people in, sometimes without running them through the checklist first. I will not romanticize the unmaking of my armor. Some of that armor was useful. It kept someone alive. It kept evidence safe. It taught me diligence. But the cost of staying too long was not measured in heroic metrics. It was measured in the tiny absences. A friend who stopped calling. A partner who grew impatient with a guarded laugh. The loss of a readiness to be surprised by joy. Those losses required repair that had nothing to do with systems and everything to do with practice. There were things we never spoke of in grand declarations. A joke about burnt pasta became a recurring ritual. Elena would bring it up at the precise moment my face clouded with the desire to make a plan for everything. Burn the pasta, she'd say with an absurd solemnity, and we'd laugh because we both knew it meant, allow the human thing. Marcus would roll his eyes and then sit down for a bowl. Sarah, who had once handed us logs from a desk that smelled faintly of coffee, stayed in touch. She came by sometimes, sat in the kitchen, and watched the city wake. The small network we had assembled did not dissolve when the case closed. It rearranged into something softer. I still keep a labeled power strip, and I will not lie. There is a small part of me that will always check a door twice. Old muscles do not unlearn themselves entirely. But the difference now is that those muscles are not the entirety of who I am. They are part of a toolkit I can choose to use when needed and then set down. I am learning to set them down more often. There is a final image I keep with me. Elena at the window on a late spring evening, the city's light arriving like a warm amphora. She had opened the apartment door for a breath of air and left it ajar. The open door in our building is not a cinematic metaphor in the way novels make it out to be. It is a small domestic risk. It is a choice. I stood beside her at the sill, watching the street like an ordinary person, and not a man with a command center in the bedroom. She turned to me, the window light catching a new patience in her face. "You didn't have to stay," she said, as if reading the thought I hadn't dared to invent yet. "I know," I answered, and meant it. The truth of my staying was complicated: protective instincts, professional pride, the sense of having become essential. But the thing the title asks us to name is not whether staying could be justified. It is the cost. I stayed too long, and lost myself. That sentence is not repentance alone. It is recognition. It is a ledger entry of the soul. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Light, certain. "Then stop," she said simply. "Open more doors. Let people in for reasons other than emergencies. It is still work." Some mornings the checklist wins, and I find myself drafting contingencies for the week. Some nights I wake and catch myself counting the thumbnails on old monitors. But more often now, I find myself answering a phone because a friend is calling, agreeing to dinner because someone wants company, stepping into a random Friday with no plan and no exit strategy. Those are the small victories. There is no tidy moral to hang on the end of this. Julian's consequences were institutional and slow. That was the point. Elena's restoration was legal and painstaking. She deserved nothing less. My own repair is small and incremental. I still cherish the tool set I built. It's part of who I am, but I no longer allow it to define the boundaries of my life. We keep a sticky note by the front door with the word trust, written in a deliberate, almost militant script. It is a ridiculous thing, and also the thing that has saved us from becoming what we rescued people from. Lives that are all armor and no skin. I sometimes think of the night Elena first leaned on my doorframe. I think of the dried tear on her cheek, the sedan across the street, the business card with 48 hours written on it like a sentence. I stayed. I watched. I protected. I lost things, small, vital things. But being present to the process of reclaiming them has been its own education. The work of living is not a program you lock into place. It is a series of choices you make again and again. To watch and to trust, to be vigilant and to open, to be steady and to be vulnerable. If this story moved you, share a moment when someone opened a door for you. If you want more stories like this, consider liking and subscribing.